And thanks for this. This opportunity. I'm going to talk about a good learning environment and maybe some things that make learning environments a little less good. In order to do that, I'll start out with a little quiz about a kindergarten design, and then talk about the evaluation process, what we call the post-occupancy evaluation process. I'll then quickly show you a few slides of a New Zealand school which we evaluated, and then talk about the lessons learned that come through again and again and again, because those are the things I think we can focus on to make a better learning environment. And finally, I'd like to talk about not just once we've learned those lessons, how we can actually make sure that they're applied. And just incidentally, this photograph here is of a university seminar room built for a new type of teaching. And when we did the evaluation, we found that they hadn't changed their teaching practices. So that was one of the key lessons learned from the evaluation, and they had to go back to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor and say that the teaching practices need to catch up to where they were planned to be. All right, so just before I start on the little quiz, I'd like to just tell you about where I'm from. This is New Zealand, the capital city, called Wellington, and it's known as the windy capital because we get heaps of wind. And we also have earthquakes thanks to a fault line coming down on the left side of there in the shade of the hill. We have it's ready to cause another big earthquake at any moment. The last big one 150 years ago put 2 metres of sea level on the main street. And so we're preparing for the next one. We had actually one a few months ago, and that required 2 new buildings to be demolished because they had suffered some minor damage, and one 1960s building to be demolished, all around 10 stories or 6 to 10 stories. So it's an exciting place. And we like Norwegians, we enjoy sailing on this harbour and walking in these mountains around our city. Right. So the quiz. I'd like to just ask you to think about this building, which is in Norway. It's a kindergarten we evaluated with Norconsult a few months ago in midsummer. So this is a very typical sort of project where I'd be asked to come in and evaluate, find out the things that work well and the things that don't work so well. And this is being done to help the commune who is about to start planning another new kindergarten. So I just ask you, what do you think the users might have said about this area? Anyone want to guess? Just call out answers if you wish. Okay, they actually said 3 things. Firstly, they said they bump into this curb here. They said it's dangerous for the children. And lots of people have bikes, apparently, nowhere to park them. And so the next one is this playground. If you're welcome to take a guess if anyone wants to say what they think might have been learned about this playground. Well, the first thing is the safety surface, the soft matting surface, fills up with 10 centimetres of ice in the winter, so it's not so safe. And about 1/3 of the parents, so about 25 or 30 parents, need to bring their children down the sloping path every morning and back up. And they have extreme difficulty in the ice, so that was a useful lesson learned. Also, the path is muddy, so mud comes into the building, and stones from the path come onto the safety surface, so it's not so comfortable to fall on. But finally, this one I hadn't predicted is that the kids use that slope as a perfect little sledging ramp, but unfortunately there's a board along the bottom in the little playhouse, so smack into there. It's not so successful. It would have been nice to have had a run out, just nicer for the kids. And of course, in summer they were using it with little trucks to ride down on. Any guesses for this one? Ice fell off the roof. Hadn't been prepared for, designed for. This is quite a common one. Noise from mechanical plant in the building, the heating and ventilating plant. And this one here, we learned that quite a few people fell over on this, was exposed to the sky and therefore radiation and the ice. so they have to grit it, but people have fallen. And in the entrance area, that's carpeted with fixed carpet, but unfortunately a lot of mud's brought in. And in the locker area, as you can see, they haven't designed for the size of children. You know, if we had this in a gymnasium or something for adult lockers, I mean, of course it would be treated as a joke and thrown away and proper lockers be brought in, but no, these kids are still have this. And the other thing is that they need twice as much space as they've actually got for all their winter clothing, because they have about 3 to 5 sets of winter clothing in the when it gets wet at lunchtimes and so on. And this one here is to do with windowsill height. They would like windows that they can actually see out of. And to be fair, this building did have several windows, maybe about half of them, which were right down at knee height for us. And the kids loved them. They sat in there in the sunny windows and looked out and just had that nice interaction, but unfortunately only half of them. And this one here is, because there was inadequate storage, there was only about 10% of the storage was actually provided for changing nappies and that sort of thing. They had to provide, or they did provide these extra wire racks, and that led to these consequential problems of the cleaner being unable to clean. So they need about 10 times as much storage or some other way of resolving that problem. Right, so I'll now move on to just telling you a little bit about how we do these evaluations. And the most important thing is the people who use the buildings, what we call the stakeholders usually. And of course they are the students, the parents representing the little children sometimes, the teachers, the principals, the cleaners, the maintenance people, and the client from the commune, the architect, the builder, an engineer if that's relevant. And sometimes we will have pedagogical experts and somebody representing future generations, because they will obviously inherit the pollution which we create from these new buildings. So we try and think of who are all of these stakeholders and get representatives to participate in the evaluation. When we have a thing like a place like a high school, we will have more groups of students than we do of, say, teachers, just because of the population of teachers. So the time at which the evaluation done is often just before briefing. So usually when there are new buildings being built every year, they'll go back and they might evaluate some of them about a year after buildings, or in the first few years after construction. But also there is a time much later when they're briefing changes to a building, they'll sometimes get us to evaluate the existing buildings. We've done that for buildings up to, say, 170 years old in the case of the Australian National Museum. And so that would be briefing for changes, the second one there. And the third example is where there are problems with the building, and we have been brought in to troubleshoot some serious problems with new buildings or building alterations. And that is where the outcome is partially to make some fine-tuning changes to the new building, but also change the way people, or help people work through the ways they want to change how they use the building, or maybe some policy changes within the organisation. So it's different ways of coping with the difficult situation they've created. And this is an example of one of those. This is a university space where all of the academics were taken out of offices and put into a hot desking shared space. And they ended up with problems like this, of conversations interrupting the productivity of the man sitting down here. And this is part of the walkthrough interview, where the two women here are demonstrating how they might be having a conversation that's disrupting this other person. So that we use photographs a lot to communicate, as well as the words that we record, we note down. And when we're doing these walkthrough interviews, we're very careful not to suggest what people might talk about. It's the topics that they discuss are their topics, not mine, because it's their building and they've been using it for a year or two or more sometimes. and it's up to them to talk about what's important to them. And so we use this objective prompt, which is the building itself, and that becomes a spatial agenda. So as we go through the building, it regulates the conversation and discussion, and also helps as a group. They bounce ideas off each other and develop their thoughts and discussion as they go. Also, it's important to talk about specific elements, because windows on one facade of the building will be quite different. Possibly the effect on the use will be quite different than windows on the other side. And we're always negotiating this buildings in terms of use under operating conditions to try to achieve the productivity and well-being. So that is what I think of as this three-legged stool. We don't want buildings for buildings. All we want them to do is to be able to hold a conference in, or to learn in, or if we're in a bank, we've evaluated a lot of banks, so it's going and getting a mortgage, or going and getting your money, or something like that. And we're constantly negotiating this building design in terms of its uses under operating conditions. Now, just in more detail, the way we go about these buildings is, firstly, we identify the stakeholders. We invite them to come to the interviews. We have a series of interviews which can last usually up to a week, sometimes more. And then we'll run through interviews with each group. So we interview groups of kids together, little kids, medium-sized kids, the older kids, and a couple of groups of teachers, facilities people, and Ministry of Education and so on, Education Department. Document all of what they say using photographs, and I apologise for these dots on their faces, because what I want to do is capture their expression of delight or disgust so often, and fear sometimes, because that's to communicate back to the Department of Education. In this case, of course, I haven't got their permission to show it to you, so I've not used, well, in this case, Maddie's photo. She was talking about getting her little trolley through there, and every time she had to go to the bathroom, she had to get a teacher to help, because they just had regular door closers. Anyway, once all of that information is documented, we take it away and generate recommendations. So the first bit is their information, the second bit is my recommendation as to how to resolve the problems or enhance the strengths of the building, and provide that recommendation to the client. Also, there are the word or phrase post-occupancy evaluation, of course, just means evaluating or looking at a building after it's finished and used. Other colleagues also include different sorts of professional studies within that definition. I treat those as a separate exercise, but sometimes there can be a independent benefits realisation review, so that's a project management process. Sometimes there might be an opinion survey about the building in general, or one aspect of it. As you know, there are all sorts of green building rating systems around the world. For example, the BREEAM one out of the UK and LEED out of the USA. And sometimes there might be energy analysis of the building. So all of those things can fit under the general umbrella. Other people refer to those as post-occupancy evaluations as well. Now, just quickly, I'd like to show you through a New Zealand a New Zealand school evaluation, which we went through about 3 years ago. Our climate's a little warmer than yours. My city is about the same distance from the equator as Barcelona, but we're in the middle of the ocean, so it's a very temperate climate. And this is an evaluation which took place over about a week, involving 58 people in groups, as you can see here, these groups. And here's the infant block of the school, so it's all single story, separate blocks, which was a problem for these teachers when it's raining, so they're emphasising that point. And these are kind of conventional classrooms with a little bit of flexibility amongst the furniture, but they really liked these wide corridor workspaces here, as they have done in other schools which we've evaluated in New Zealand and in the UK. One of the surprising little details to come out of this one was that when the kids are sitting on these bean bags against the double glazing and the sun's coming in, the glass cracked quite a few times, so it's just a new one. And a little girl demonstrating how hard it is to open some of these doors. And here's one of the larger open plan classrooms where they've got, I think, around 75 kids doing different activities, and then they did have a separate glass classroom within that as well, but typical scene from that school. Now the corridor space, this is in the more senior block, and the children were demonstrating how they use this space, and they found it very successful. Here's this teacher talking about the sunsets in the west here. The screen is in the west. It's hard to see the screen when you've got the sun, so he's trying to convey this message through to the Ministry of Education so that they can perhaps not make this mistake next time. Kids talking about the library. Oh, this was the anti-bullying strategy, the glazed wash hand areas next to the toilets. But unfortunately, one of the doors was used for bullying, so yeah, for holding a kid in the corner. And this teacher's work area. Oh, and this was a big surprise. There was a cladding detail. The outside cladding of the building had a detail on it which allowed these mice to get into the building. And so the job of the maintenance person every morning was to go and clear his traps, and he had a good haul that morning. So I'd never come across that before, but made for a good photograph. And he also was talking about the lack of taps for irrigating the landscape, which is quite a problem which comes up now and again. So I'd like to talk about more of those now. So I think there's about 10 here of problems that come up again and again in different schools and other buildings in the countries where I've worked. And that is these countries, mostly in New Zealand, a few dozen evaluations in Australia, and about 10 in the UK. And the building types have been about 1/3 education buildings, 1/3 police, courts, corrections and military, and 1/3 of others, which include commercial libraries and hospitals and things like that. But just about every type of public building you can think of we've evaluated. And we've got one coming up in Moscow next month, which will be a school there, a private school. So that'll be particularly interesting. So the first one I want to mention is this one about designs that create a dangerous situation for children and within the car situation with cars coming and going. This was a car park designed as part of the school, with the entrance right next to the pedestrian entrance. So it created a danger. And these are the things that the parents and teachers said. So they're talking about a serious problem, just like the Norwegian project I showed you earlier. They're saying it's dangerous. And I would really like them to stop building these sort of situations, because one day a child could really get killed. A university project here where they had complicated light switching. We had to press it twice for these lights up and 3 times for those. Now that might not matter if you're at home or in your own office, but if you're a nervous lecturer coming up into the lecture room and you've only got 5 minutes to get your PowerPoint plugged in and answer a couple of questions from students, you don't need these extra little problems. This one is actually in a performing arts university building in Australia, but the other one was a medical school in New Zealand. Obstructions, we seem to be still creating obstructions. This student bruised her elbow the day before the evaluation, and the one in the bottom centre there is a school, and others are a hospital, a military training centre and a couple of other things. This is the ceiling of the school which I showed you earlier. You can see the rainwater stains there on the ceiling panels. So, we should be able to prevent that problem. And this is one which comes through again and again. It's teachers using PowerPoint presentations not having eye-to-eye contact. This teacher was required to sit behind the students when they looked at the thing, and we've had variations on that theme through quite a few education buildings and technical colleges. Noise in some of these open planning areas, although New Zealand is quite good I believe, at coaching teachers into the new ways of teaching. And connection of toilets, visual, sound and smell connection of toilets in various ways. That's a commercial office building on the top left in London, and a school bottom left, university there, and cleaners' rooms. So I see that I've got about 3 minutes left, I think. So I'd like to now tell you about the way in which I think we can actually prevent these problems from ever happening in any new building ever again. And I'd like to try and do that before I retire. So one more question for you. These problems that I've been talking about are apparently all caused by one thing when I ask the project team or teams, because of course I'm interviewing the clients and the architects and the builders, and they're all caused by one thing. Anybody want to have a guess what that is? It's actually the other guy. So it's no one in the project team is responsible. It's actually the other guy. So when I realised that, I thought, well, what else is common about these problems? Well, they're very costly to learning. There are similar sorts of problems in the countries where I've worked, and they're historical. For example, leaky roofs. They've been around for a long time, I'm quite sure of that. And we know the physics of how these work. And they're also very preventable, because we've got a fantastic array of materials that we can specify and design, so we can prevent these problems quite easily if we choose to. But unfortunately, we're often under pressure to prioritise time and cost, so quality gets left off. Luckily, we've got colleagues, or we've got other professions who use this method of checklists to prevent it, and in medicine as well. They use them all the time. Well, since 1937 in aviation, and more recently in medicine, the World Health Organization and others have introduced them. And we could use the same in the building industry. We could apply them at review stages, just like they apply them before takeoff and on final approach and before operate in the pre-op room and medical treatment. We could base them on knowledge which has come through again and again in these evaluations. They say, people like Boeing say, that we need to use precise language. We need to use this team approach in doing that. We've got teams. We could have a principal or an architect or a client or a builder applying a checklist, and they say that they needed to be tested a lot to make sure that the meanings are the same to everybody. So I think it's really all we need to do is knowledge and care. And I've made up this example here, which is a way of trying to get people to provide drainage on floors in kitchens and balconies and things like that. I've described the recurring failure that we see again and again, the effects of that, which in this case can be slipping and falling, and finally a solution for that, which is that risk management process at the bottom. So effectively it's care and knowledge, or knowledge and care. And I've tested that with architects and capital works managers around the world. They say they would use it. Their buildings are at risk, and the primary responsibility for that is the client. It could be summarised for politicians like this, and it could be a mobile app. And I'm actually about to start testing a mobile app, so if anyone wants to trial that, you'd be very welcome. You can just call me on these email or one of these social media contacts. Thank you.